You stand at the edge of a forest older than the cities you know, older than the roads that brought you here, older than the names people have given to the places where wildness begins and civilization pauses to catch its breath. The trees rise in layers of shadow and filtered light, their canopy so dense that even at midday the forest floor exists in a kind of perpetual twilight, neither day nor night but something suspended between the two. You can smell the earth here, rich and dark and patient, the scent of things growing and things decaying in the same breath, the endless cycle of transformation that forests understand better than any textbook or teacher could explain. This is a story about gifts, but not the kind wrapped in bright paper and ribbon, not the kind exchanged during holidays or birthdays or moments of celebration. These are different gifts entirely, offered by hands that might not be hands, accepted by people who did not fully understand what they were accepting until it was already too late to give them back. The story unfolds slowly because that is the only way such stories can be told. Rushing through the details would be like trying to sprint through deep snow, exhausting and ultimately pointless. You need to settle in, let your breathing slow, allow the rhythm of the words to match the rhythm of your heartbeat as it gradually decelerates toward the edge of sleep. The forest has always been a place of exchange. Long before humans built their first settlements, before they learned to plant seeds in neat rows or domesticate animals that once ran wild, the forest was already ancient, already operating according to rules that existed before language could name them. In the forest, everything trades with everything else. Trees exchange sugars through vast underground networks of fungal threads. Birds distribute seeds in exchange for the fruit that sustains them. Predators cull the weak and sick, keeping populations healthy in exchange for their own survival. It is a system of constant negotiation, of give and take so fundamental that it happens without thought, without intention, simply because that is how forests work, how they have always worked, how they will continue to work long after you and everyone you know has returned to the earth that made you. But there are other exchanges in the forest, exchanges that do not fit neatly into the categories that biologists recognize or ecologists can chart on their diagrams. These are the exchanges that happen at dusk when the light is failing and you find yourself further from the trail than you intended. They are the transactions that occur when you are lost, when you are frightened, when you are desperate enough that an offer of help seems like salvation, rather than something that should make you pause and consider the cost. The forest has always had its spirits, its watchers, its beings that exist in the spaces between what is known and what is whispered about on nights when the wind moves through the branches with a sound almost like breathing. You have heard the stories, perhaps, though you might not have recognized them as stories about the same thing. The traveller who accepted a lantern from a stranger on a dark road and was never seen in their hometown again. The child who took a carved wooden toy from an old woman at the edge of the woods and began speaking a language no one recognized. The hiker who gratefully drank from a cup offered by a figure glimpsed only in peripheral vision, and afterward could never quite remember the way back to ordinary life. These stories exist in every culture that has lived near forests, near wild places where human rules thin out and other rules begin to apply. The details change from telling to telling, the names shift with geography and time, but the core remains constant, unchanging as the forest itself. The gift is always perfect. That is the first thing to understand. It arrives at exactly the moment you need it most, offered with a kind of courteous inevitability that makes refusal seem not just rude, but somehow impossible. Like declining gravity or arguing with the sunrise, you are cold and a cloak appears, woven from materials you cannot quite identify but softer than anything you have ever touched. You are hungry and food is offered, strange fruits that smell of honey and summer afternoons, bread that steams as though fresh from an oven you cannot see. You're lost, hopelessly turned around in terrain that all looks the same, and someone appears to guide you, their presence calm and reassuring and utterly confident in their knowledge of these trackless woods. The offer is made with grace, with a politeness that belongs to an older time, to codes of behaviour that existed before your grandparents were born. The figure who offers might be tall or short, young or old, clear in your vision, or strangely blurred at the edges as though you're seeing them through old glass or tears, or the distortion that happens when you stare at something too long in dim light. They speak, usually, though their words might come to you as thought rather than sound, arriving in your mind fully formed and perfectly understandable, regardless of what language you normally speak. The phrasing is always courteous, always respectful, always framed as an offer rather than a command. You are not forced. That is crucial to understand. You are never forced. The choice, such as it is, remains yours. But choice becomes complicated when you are desperate, when you are in pain, when you are so tired that you cannot remember the last time you felt rested. Choice becomes theoretical when the alternative to acceptance is suffering or danger, or the very real possibility of not surviving to see another dawn. This is how the gifts work, how they have always worked. They arrive when you're most vulnerable, when your defenses are low, when the part of your mind that usually asks questions and weighs consequences has been worn down by exhaustion, or fear, or simple human need. You stand in the forest now, in your imagination, if not in physical fact, and you can almost see how it would happen. The light is fading, draining from the sky in that particular way that happens in autumn, when the darkness seems to rise from the ground rather than fall from above. The temperature is dropping, a cold that starts in your fingers and toes and slowly works inward, and you realize with the first stirring of real concern that you're not sure which direction leads back to your car, back to the trail, back to the world of electric lights and central heating, and all the comfortable certainties of modern life. You've been walking for hours, or what you think has been hours, time moves strangely under the trees, and your phone has no signal, has not had a signal for longer than you care to admit. That is when you see them, standing beside a tree you swear was not there a moment ago, or perhaps it was there all along, and you simply failed to notice it until they drew your attention to it by their presence. They are watching you with an expression that might be concern or curiosity or something else entirely, something for which you do not have a name. They do not speak immediately, and you find yourself doing the same, held in a moment of mutual observation that stretches out like taffy, thin and long and strangely sweet despite the circumstances. When they finally speak, their voice is neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something that encompasses all possibilities and commits to none. They say that you look lost, which is a statement of fact rather than a question, and you find yourself nodding because denying the obvious seems pointless and more than a little foolish. They say that the forest can be confusing to those who do not know its ways, and again you nod, feeling something like gratitude that they are not mocking you, not making you feel stupid for your situation, even though a part of you thinks perhaps you should feel stupid, should have been more careful, should have paid better attention to where you were going and how to get back. They say that they could help you if you would like, and the phrasing is important, the conditional nature of the offer, the way it positions you as the one with power to accept or decline. And then they produce something from the folds of their clothing, or perhaps they were holding it all along and you simply did not notice, your attention focused on their face, on trying to read an expression that remains frustratingly neutral. It is a compass, small and old-fashioned, the kind with a brass case that clicks shut with a satisfying sound. They hold it out to you, balanced on their palm, and you can see even from a distance that the needle is moving, swinging in a slow arc as though searching for true north in a place where north might mean something different than it does on the maps you know. They say that this will guide you home, that you need only follow where it points, and you will find your way back before full darkness falls. They say it with such certainty, such calm assurance, that you find yourself believing them, find yourself already reaching out before you have consciously decided to take what they are offering. Your hand extends, your fingers spread, and in that moment before contact is made, before the cool metal of the compass touches your skin, something inside you hesitates, some deep instinct that has been honed over millennia of human evolution in places where danger wore friendly faces and death came disguised as assistance. But the moment passes or you ignore it, and your fingers close around the compass and the figure smiles, or at least you think they smile, though their face remains strangely difficult to remember clearly even as you're looking directly at it. They nod, a gesture of satisfaction or completion, and they step back, melting into the shadows between the trees, with a grace that seems impossible for anything that occupies physical space. You blink, and they are gone, and you are alone again in the darkening forest with a compass in your hand and a growing sense that something important has just happened, though you cannot quite articulate what or why it feels important. The compass works exactly as promised. The needle points steadily in one direction, never wavering, never showing the small fluctuations that real compasses display as they react to local magnetic fields and the iron deposits in the earth beneath your feet. You follow it, and within an hour you emerge from the forest at exactly the spot where you parked your car, which seems like remarkable luck, or perhaps something more than luck, something that makes you glance back at the trees one more time before you unlock your door and slide into the familiar seat. You drive home and you eat dinner, and you shower away the dirt and sweat of the day, and you climb into bed feeling fortunate that the situation resolved so easily, so neatly, with no harm done and only a good story to tell later about getting lost and being helped by a stranger in the woods. You place the compass on your nightstand, thinking vaguely that you should probably try to return it, though you have no idea how you would find the person who gave it to you, cannot even really remember what they looked like beyond a general impression of courtesy and calm. You sleep, and you dream of walking through endless forests where the trees grow so close together that their branches interweave into a solid canopy above you, blocking out the sky entirely. In the dream you're searching for something, though you do not know what, following paths that branch and merge and double back on themselves, in patterns that make sense while you're asleep, but will evaporate like morning fog the moment you wake. The dream is not frightening exactly, but it carries a weight, a significance that presses down on you like humidity before a storm. You wake to sunlight streaming through your bedroom window, and you lie there for a moment orienting yourself, remembering where you are and what day it is, and what responsibilities await you. You reach for your phone to check the time, and your hand brushes against the compass, cool and solid and somehow more present than other objects in the room, as though it occupies space more definitively than your lamp, or your books, or the framed photograph on the wall. You pick it up, meaning to examine it more closely in daylight, to see if there is a maker's mark or any indication of where it came from. The compass opens at your touch, the lid springing back with that same satisfying click you noticed yesterday. But the needle, which should point north no matter where you are or how you turn, instead swings to point directly at your bedroom window, at the view of your backyard that shows the line of trees marking the edge of the forest, preserve that borders your property. You turn, rotating your body to face different directions, and the needle follows, always pointing toward the forest, toward the trees, toward the place where you accepted this gift from hands that might not have been hands. This is when you begin to understand that the gift was not quite what it seemed, that the transaction was not as simple as borrowing a compass and finding your way home, but understanding comes slowly, unfolding over days and weeks as the pattern becomes clear, as you notice the small changes that accumulate like snow, insignificant in individual flakes but eventually capable of burying everything you recognize. You find yourself thinking about the forest constantly, not in the way you might think about a pleasant place you visited once and hope to see again, but with a pull that feels almost physical, a magnetism that draws your attention even when you're trying to focus on other things. At work, you catch yourself staring out the window in the direction of the trees even though you cannot see them from your office. At home, you stand in your backyard at dusk, watching the shadows gather beneath the branches, feeling something like homesickness, though you have never lived anywhere near a forest before. Grew up in suburbs and cities where trees were ornamental features rather than the dominant presence. The compass becomes your constant companion, though you do not remember consciously deciding to carry it with you. It appears in your pocket, in your bag, on your desk, always within reach, always ready to remind you which direction leads back to the place where you were lost and then found. You begin taking walks in the forest preserve, telling yourself that you're getting exercise, enjoying nature, taking advantage of the resource that exists so conveniently near your home. But the walks grow longer, the paths you follow less defined, and you notice that you are navigating not by the trail markers the Park Service has installed, but by the compass, following its needle deeper into areas where other hikers rarely venture. People comment that you seem distracted, distant, that you're difficult to reach even when standing right beside them. Your partner asks if something is wrong, if you are unhappy, if there is something you need to talk about. You reassure them that everything is fine, and perhaps you even believe it, cannot point to any specific problem or complaint that would justify their concern. You are eating, sleeping, going to work, fulfilling your responsibilities. But something has shifted, some fundamental orientation of your being, and the compass knows, has always known, was designed specifically to create this exact sensation of being drawn inexorably back to the forest. You start researching late at night when you cannot sleep, searching for information about forest spirits and gift-giving, and the folklore of obligation and exchange. The stories are everywhere once you start looking, scattered through cultures and continents, consistent in their warning even as the details vary. Do not accept gifts from strangers in wild places. Do not eat food offered by those who have no clear reason to help you. Do not take anything from the forest that did not grow there naturally. The prohibitions are ancient and specific and utterly unanimous in their insistence that such exchanges always carry a cost, always create a debt, always bind you to something you did not fully understand when you agreed to the transaction. You learn about the concept of threshold spaces, places where the ordinary world and something else exist in close proximity, where the boundaries between them grow thin enough to step across without necessarily meaning to. Forests are threshold spaces, especially old forests where human activity has been minimal, where the trees have been allowed to grow according to their own logic rather than human planning. Dusk is a threshold time, neither day nor night but the liminal moment between them. Being lost is a threshold state, suspended between knowing where you are and admitting that you have no idea, between confidence and fear. You are in a threshold space at a threshold time in a threshold state, and that is when they found you, when they are always most able to find those who might be receptive to their offers. The research does not tell you how to return the compass, how to break whatever bond was formed when you accepted it. Or rather, it tells you too many things, contradictory and complex and requiring resources or knowledge or courage you're not sure you possess. Some sources say you must return to the exact spot where the gift was given and leave it there at the same time of day, though how you would identify the exact spot in a forest where every tree looks essentially like every other tree remains unclear. Other sources insist that you must find the original giver and formally return the item with specific words of thanks and release, which seems equally impossible when you cannot remember what the giver looked like, or even if they were fully solid or partially translucent or something in between. Still, other sources suggest that once a gift is accepted, it cannot be returned at all, that the bond is permanent and the only choice is to learn to live with it, to accommodate the obligation into your life as best you can, and hope that the price demanded is not higher than you can afford to pay. This possibility frightens you more than the others because it suggests finality, a door closing that cannot be reopened, a choice made in a moment of desperation that echoes forward through all the moments that follow. You stop carrying the compass, deliberately leaving it at home when you go to work, placing it in a drawer rather than on your nightstand. For a few hours you feel lighter, freed from the constant awareness of its presence. But by midday you are thinking about it obsessively, wondering if it is still in the drawer or if it has migrated to some other location, possessed of a mobility you never granted it. You rush home during your lunch break, a behaviour so unusual that your co-workers exchange glances behind your back, and you find the compass exactly where you left it, patient and unchanging and somehow radiating a sense of disappointment or perhaps reproach. That night you dream again of forests, but these dreams are different, darker, filled with a sense of searching without finding, of calling without answer, of walking paths that loop back on themselves endlessly. You wake exhausted, more tired than when you went to bed, and the compass sits on your nightstand, though you are certain you replaced it in the drawer before sleeping. You pick it up because refusing to pick it up seems impossible, seems like fighting against gravity or arguing with sunrise, and the needle points toward the forest as it always does, steady and sure and utterly implacable in its insistence. The forest calls, or perhaps that is the wrong way to phrase it. Perhaps the forest simply waits with the infinite patience of things that measure time in centuries rather than minutes. The trees do not care if you come today or tomorrow or next week. They have been standing for decades or centuries, and they will continue standing long after you and your compass and your complicated feelings about obligation have all returned to the soil that feeds their roots. But the compass cares, or the thing that gave you the compass cares, or there is a mechanism in motion that does not require caring. Only momentum, only the inexorable working out of cause and effect, of gift and debt, of acceptance and consequence. You return to the forest that weekend, telling yourself that you're simply going for a walk, that you need fresh air and exercise and time away from screens and responsibilities. You do not bring the compass consciously, but when you reach into your jacket pocket for your keys, your fingers brush against its cool surface and you are not surprised. have perhaps moved beyond surprise into a kind of resigned acceptance of the way things are going to be from now on. The compass opens at your touch, and the needle points deeper into the forest, away from the marked trails, away from the areas where other hikers might be spending their Saturday morning. You follow because following seems easier than resisting, because a part of you wants to know what happens next, wants to understand the full shape of the transaction you entered into that evening when the light was failing and you were lost, and someone offered help. The terrain grows rougher, the ground uneven with roots and rocks, the canopy overhead so dense that the forest floor exists in permanent twilight, even though the sun is high in the sky somewhere above the leaves. You walk for what feels like hours but might be minutes. Time does not work properly here, has perhaps never worked properly in places where the old rules still apply. You come to a clearing, though clearing is not quite the right word because there are still trees, they simply stand farther apart, allowing shafts of sunlight to reach the ground and illuminate patches of moss and wildflowers that bloom in shades you cannot quite name. In the centre of the space stands the figure you remember or think you remember. Their appearance no clearer now than it was the first time, as though your eyes refuse to properly focus on their form, or your brain cannot process the information your eyes are sending. They do not seem surprised to see you, do not react as though your arrival is unexpected or remarkable. They simply stand there, waiting with the same patience the forest shows, with the same sense of existing outside the usual flow of cause and effect. You open your mouth to speak, to demand explanations or request release, or simply ask why. But the words evaporate before reaching your tongue, and you find yourself silent, held in place by their regard or by your own uncertainty about what you want to say. They speak first, their voice unchanged from your memory, neither masculine nor feminine, neither young nor old. They say that you have been using their gift, that the compass has served you well, and there is something in the phrasing that makes you understand that service is the wrong way to think about what has been happening. The compass has not been serving you. You have been serving it, or serving whatever purpose it was designed to fulfill, carrying it with you and thinking about it, and allowing it to reorient your entire life toward the forest, toward this moment, toward standing in this clearing, facing a being whose nature you cannot determine and whose intentions remain opaque. You try to return the compass, holding it out in your palm the way they once held it out to you, offering it back and hoping that the gesture will be accepted, that the transaction can be reversed as simply as it began. But they do not reach for it, do not move at all, and you understand without being told that return is not so simple, that what was given cannot be taken back through mere relinquishment. The gift has already changed you, already created pathways in your brain and patterns in your behaviour, already established connections between you and the forest that cannot be severed by the simple act of giving back an object. They explain, or perhaps you understand without explanation, that the compass was never really about direction, was never truly intended to help you find your way home that first evening. It was a seed, planted in you during a moment of vulnerability, designed to grow and spread and eventually transform you into something other than what you were. The transformation is not complete, not yet, but it progresses steadily, fed by every moment you spend thinking about the forest, every walk you take following the needle, every night you dream of endless trees and pathless wandering. The being tells you that you can still choose, though the parameters of choice have narrowed considerably since that first evening. You can continue as you have been, allowing the transformation to progress at its natural pace, gradually becoming more attuned to the forest and less connected to the human world you once considered home. Eventually you will simply fail to return from one of your walks, will disappear into the trees the way others have disappeared before you, and people will search but they will not find you, because you will have crossed a threshold that does not permit backward passage. Or you can try to resist, can attempt to sever the connection by refusing to carry the compass, refusing to think about the forest, refusing to acknowledge the pull you feel toward wild places and threshold times. But resistance has a cost too, the being explains, their tone neither threatening nor sympathetic but simply informative, presenting facts the way a weather report might present the likelihood of rain. Fighting against the bond will exhaust you, will drain your energy and occupy your thoughts just as fully as surrender would, and the outcome remains uncertain. Some have managed to break free, but many have not, and there is no way to know in advance which category you fall into. The third option is acceptance of a different kind, a conscious choice to work with the bond rather than against it, to acknowledge the debt and negotiate its repayment rather than pretending it does not exist. This is the most complex path, requiring you to learn the rules that govern these exchanges, to study the old ways and the old words, to become fluent in a language of reciprocity and obligation that your culture has largely forgotten. It is possible to satisfy the debt through service, through acts of protection and stewardship, through becoming a kind of intermediary between the forest and the human world, warning others away from accepting gifts and explaining the true cost of thoughtless exchange. You stand in the clearing holding the compass, and none of the options sound appealing, all of them requiring sacrifice and effort and a fundamental reordering of your life. You think about refusing all three choices, about simply walking away and pretending this conversation never happened, but you know with the certainty of dreams and intuition that refusal is not actually available to you, that the time for refusal was that first evening before your fingers closed around the compass, before you allowed need and fear to override caution. The being waits while you process this information, while you work through anger and regret and a desperate desire to return to the person you were before you got lost in the forest that day. But that person is already gone, or already changing the transformation underway whether you acknowledge it or not. The compass has done its work, has established the connection it was designed to create, and now you must simply decide how you will live with the consequences. You ask, finally finding your voice, why they do this, why they offer gifts to lost travellers and desperate wanderers. The being considers your question, tilting their head in a gesture that might be thoughtful or might be amused, or might mean something else entirely in whatever system of communication they normally use. They say that they do it because that is what they do, because offering is their nature the way growing is the nature of trees and flowing is the nature of water. They do not question it any more than you question breathing or your heart beating in your chest. It simply is, has always been, will continue to be long after you and your confusion have been absorbed back into the cycle of growth and decay that governs all living things. They say that humans have forgotten how to properly navigate threshold spaces, have lost the knowledge that your ancestors carried about how to move safely through places where different rules apply. You see a door in the forest, and you walk through it without checking if you can walk back. You accept gifts from strangers without asking what obligations might come attached. You take what you want from wild places without considering what might be required in return. The forest spirits do not punish this ignorance, they simply operate according to their nature, and if humans suffer consequences from their own lack of understanding, that is tragedy perhaps, but not injustice. You want to argue, want to insist that the playing field is not level, that they possess knowledge and power that you lack, that the exchange was not truly fair or free. But you know even as the impulse forms that fairness is a human concept, that the forest does not care about fairness any more than it cares about democracy or human rights, or any of the other organizing principles of your civilization. The forest operates according to older laws, simpler laws of energy exchange and equilibrium, and the constant negotiation between competing forces. You entered the forest and you accepted a gift, and now there are consequences, and arguing about whether that is fair accomplishes nothing except delaying your decision about how to proceed. The being says that you should go home now, that you have been given the information you need, and further conversation will not clarify anything or make your choices easier. They say that the compass will continue to work as it always has, pointing toward the forest, reminding you of the bond you created and the decision that still awaits. They say that you have time, not infinite time, but enough, and that they will know when you have made your choice, even if you never return to this clearing, even if you never see them again in a form you can recognize. They step back, or perhaps you step back, or perhaps the clearing itself shifts in some way that increases the distance between you without either of you actually moving. The light changes, growing dimmer or brighter or simply different, and you blink against the change, and when your vision clears, the being is gone and you're alone among the trees with the compass, heavy in your hand, and your heart beating fast with a mixture of fear and understanding, and something that might be grief for the simple life you thought you were living before you got lost in the forest that day. You walk back to your car, and this time you do not follow the compass, but rather the sounds of traffic on the distant highway, the noise of human civilization that suddenly seems precious and fragile and utterly insufficient as protection against the older powers that wait in the shadows. You drive home, and you sit in your living room, and you stare at the compass lying on your coffee table. and you try to decide which impossible path you will choose from the options that are being presented. Days pass, and then weeks, and the compass remains on your coffee table, a constant presence that you find yourself glancing at dozens of times each day. You try to research the third option, the path of service and negotiation, looking for information about how previous people managed to satisfy their debts and return to something approximating normal life. The stories exist, but they are vague, filled with metaphor and symbolism that might mean anything or nothing. A person who planted 1,000 trees, a person who spent every full moon walking the boundaries of the forest and repairing the markers that keep hikers on safe paths, a person who learned to speak with animals and served as translator between the forest and nearby towns. The specifics vary, but the pattern is consistent: years or decades of dedicated service, of putting the forest's needs before your own, of accepting that you now belong partially to the wild places and can never fully return to civilization. You start small, testing the waters, trying to understand what might be required. You volunteer for trail maintenance in the forest preserve, spending Saturdays clearing fallen branches and installing erosion barriers. You feel foolish at first, wondering if the being is even aware of your efforts, or if they care about such mundane activities. But the compass seems to grow lighter on the days when you work in the forest, as though your service pleases whatever mechanism of debt and obligation governs these exchanges. You begin studying ecology and forest management, taking online courses late at night when you cannot sleep, learning about nutrient cycles and succession patterns and the complex relationships that bind forests together into living systems. The knowledge feels important, necessary for whatever role you are growing into, and you absorb it with a hunger that surprises you. You have never been particularly interested in nature before, thought of forests as pleasant places to visit occasionally, but not as subjects worthy of serious study. Now you cannot get enough, cannot stop reading and learning and trying to understand the intricate machinery of growth and decay that operates beneath the surface beauty of the trees. You notice that you're changing in other ways too, small shifts that accumulate gradually. You become more sensitive to weather, able to smell rain hours before it arrives, aware of pressure changes and wind shifts in ways you never were before. You find yourself waking at dawn without an alarm, your body attuned to the rhythms of sunrise and sunset in ways that feel ancient and instinctive. You develop preferences for foods you never liked before, craving mushrooms and wild greens and the kind of earthy flavors that you once found unpleasant. Your partner notices, comments that you seem different, harder to reach, as though you are physically present but mentally elsewhere. You try to explain, but the words sound absurd when you say them aloud. Talk of forest spirits and binding obligations and compasses that point toward debt rather than north. They listen with increasing concern, suggest that maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist perhaps, someone who could help you process whatever is happening. You agree because refusing would create conflict, but you know that no therapist can help with this, that the problem exists outside the realm of psychology or medicine, in a space where human helping professions have no power. The sessions are exactly as useless as you expected, an hour each week of talking around the issue because you cannot talk about the issue directly without sounding delusional. The therapist wants to explore your stress levels, your work-life balance, your relationship satisfaction. They suggest that your preoccupation with the forest might be a form of escape, a way of avoiding problems in other areas of your life. You nod and agree and say that yes, perhaps they are right. Perhaps you need to focus more on grounding yourself in the present moment and nurturing your human connections. You say all the things they want to hear, and they seem satisfied, and you continue carrying the compass and thinking about the forest, and feeling the slow transformation that has nothing to do with stress, or escape, or any framework that modern psychology recognizes. Months pass, and you settle into a routine of service, spending more and more time in the forest, taking vacation days to do maintenance work or simply to walk the trails and observe the changing seasons. You become known among the other volunteers, the person who is always available, always willing to take on projects, strangely knowledgeable about forest ecology despite having no formal training. They make jokes about you being a tree hugger, but the jokes are friendly, accepting, and you smile and do not tell them that you are not hugging trees out of environmental enthusiasm, but rather out of obligation to beings they do not believe exist. The compass remains with you always, though you no longer need to check it as often. You have learned to feel the pull directly, a subtle orientation in your chest that draws you toward the forest without requiring the mediation of a physical object. The compass has become almost ceremonial, a reminder of the original transaction rather than a functional tool, and you understand that this is part of the transformation. This gradual internalization of the bond until it becomes inseparable from your own sense of self. You see the being occasionally, glimpses at dusk or dawn when you're deep in the forest and far from other humans. They never approach, never speak, simply observe from a distance that might be physical, or might be some other kind of separation that you do not fully understand. Their presence no longer frightens you, has become almost comforting in its familiarity, a constant in a life that has been fundamentally destabilized by the choice you made that evening when you accepted the compass. You begin to notice other people in the forest, people who carry the same subtle markers that you have learned to recognize in yourself. They walk with a particular purposefulness, a focus that distinguishes them from casual hikers. They pause at certain trees, touch certain stones, follow paths that do not appear on any official map. You never speak to them, and they never speak to you, but you understand that you are all part of the same system, all bound by obligations that arose from moments of desperation or need, or simple bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One evening, as you walk your regular circuit through the forest, you encounter a person who is clearly lost, a young man in inadequate clothing looking around with increasing panic as the light fails. You watch from a distance as a figure emerges from between the trees, offering help with courteous inevitability, holding out something that catches the last rays of sunlight. The young man hesitates, and you find yourself stepping forward before you have consciously decided to intervene, calling out a warning that is neither rude nor detailed, simply a firm suggestion that he not accept what is being offered. The young man turns toward you confused, and the figure turns as well, their expression unreadable. You feel the weight of their attention, the pressure of having interrupted a transaction that was already in motion. But you also feel the rightness of the intervention, the sense that this is part of your service, part of how you repay the debt you incurred. You guide the young man back to the trail, using your knowledge of the forest and your increasingly reliable sense of direction. You do not tell him what he nearly accepted or what the consequences would have been. You simply see him safely out and then return to your walk, feeling the compass pulse once in your pocket like a heartbeat or a nod of acknowledgement. This becomes a pattern, another layer of service added to your maintenance work and your studying and your gradual transformation into something other than what you were. You walk the forest at threshold times, watching for lost travellers and desperate wanderers, intervening when you can, offering the warning that you wish someone had offered you that evening when you were lost and frightened, and so grateful for help that you didn't ask about the price. You cannot save everyone. Some people accept the gifts before you can reach them, and you watch with a mixture of sadness and understanding as they take the first steps on the same path you have been walking. You try to explain the rules to those you do manage to warn, the principles of threshold spaces and binding obligations, and the importance of refusing gifts from strangers in wild places. Most do not understand, cannot quite grasp why they should refuse help when they genuinely need it, cannot see beyond the immediate crisis to the longer consequences. You do your best, plant seeds of caution that might bloom later if they ever find themselves in a similar situation again. Some thank you, some seem annoyed at your interference, some simply hurry away as though you're more dangerous than whatever they were fleeing from in the first place. Years pass this way, your life increasingly divided between the human world where you maintain a job and a home and relationships, and the forest world where you perform your service and feel increasingly at home. The division grows harder to maintain, the mask you wear in civilization slipping occasionally, revealing the strangeness underneath. Your partner eventually leaves, unable to cope with your absences and your distraction, and the way you sometimes seem to be listening to voices they cannot hear. You grieve the loss, but you're not surprised, have known for a long time that normal human relationship was becoming impossible for you, that you're too far along the path of transformation to turn back to the life you once lived. You move to a small house at the very edge of the forest, a place where the boundary between human space and wild space is thin and easily crossed. You work remotely now, spending the minimum time necessary to maintain income, and the maximum time walking in the forest, performing your endless rounds of service and observation. The compass sits on your mantle, tarnished but still functional, still pointing toward the debt that you are slowly, gradually, over the course of years and decades, paying down through your attention and your labour and your willingness to exist in the space between worlds. You have become what the being offered you the option of becoming, a kind of intermediary, a guardian of the threshold, warning away those who might stumble into obligations they cannot fulfill. You are neither fully human nor fully spirit, but something in between, shaped by the choice you made and the path you chose afterward. You do not regret it precisely, though regret seems beside the point, irrelevant to a decision that was perhaps never really a decision at all, but rather an inevitability that began the moment you got lost in the forest that day. You continue your walks, your interventions, your service to the forest and the beings that inhabit it. The compass remains your companion, lighter now, its debt nearly satisfied after years of dedicated work. You understand that someday, perhaps soon, perhaps not for decades yet, you will take your final walk into the forest and simply not return. Will cross the threshold permanently and become fully part of the wild places you have been serving. The thought does not frighten you as it once would have. It seems natural now, appropriate. The logical conclusion of a story that began with desperation and an offered gift and a choice made in ignorance. And still you walk, evening after evening, watching for lost travellers and desperate wanderers, offering the warning that was never offered to you, serving the forest and the spirits and the balance between giving and taking that governs all exchanges in wild places. The compass points home now toward the forest rather than away from it, and you follow because following has become your nature, as instinctive as breathing, as inevitable as the sunrise, as permanent as the trees that have witnessed your transformation from beginning to middle, to whatever ending awaits when your service is finally complete. But completion lies far ahead yet, years of walking and warning and watching still remaining before the debt is fully paid. You settle into the work with something like contentment, something like peace, accepting the strange life you now lead as preferable to the alternatives you were offered. You are bound to the forest, yes, but the binding has become familiar, comfortable even, a structure that gives meaning to your days and purpose to your existence. You chose service, chose negotiation, chose the difficult middle path between surrender and resistance, and you live with that choice one day at a time, one walk at a time, one intervention at a time. The forest accepts your service with the same patient indifference it shows to everything, neither grateful nor ungrateful, simply absorbing your efforts the way it absorbs rain and sunlight and the slow decay of fallen leaves. You have learned not to expect acknowledgement, not to need validation from either the forest or the beings that inhabit it. The work itself is sufficient, the knowledge that you are preventing others from making your mistake. The satisfaction of seeing someone walk safely out of the forest who might otherwise have become lost in ways that have nothing to do with geography. And so you continue, year after year, aging in the house at the forest's edge, growing more attuned to wild rhythms and less concerned with human time. The compass remains your anchor, your reminder, your proof that the choice you made was real, and not some elaborate delusion or breakdown. You hold it sometimes on quiet evenings, feeling its weight, reading the direction it points like a prayer or a promise. Home, it says, always home. And home is the forest, the threshold, the space between worlds where you have learned to live and work and eventually, when your time comes, will learn to die. This is the life you chose when you chose the path of service, when you decided to work with the bond rather than against it, when you accepted that some obligations cannot be refused once accepted, but only transformed through dedication and time. It is not the life you planned, not the future you imagined during the years before you got lost in the forest that day, but it is your life now, the only one available to you, and you have learned to inhabit it with something approaching grace, moving through your days with purpose and your nights with dreams of endless forests where you walk paths that loop and branch and eventually lead you home, always home, to the place where the trees grow dense and the light falls strange and the spirits wait patiently for the lost and desperate, and those who cannot refuse help when it is offered at exactly the moment they need it most. The story does not end here because stories like this do not truly end. They simply pause, resting in the spaces between words, waiting to resume when the next lost traveller stumbles into the forest at dusk, with fear in their heart and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, will offer them help. The story continues in the compass that still points toward the forest, in the being that still stands at the clearing, offering gifts with courteous inevitability, in the slow transformation of those who accept and the long years of service that some of them choose as their way of eventually perhaps finding their way back to something approximating freedom. You are part of that continuing story now, woven into it as thoroughly as the trees are woven into the forest floor, and you will remain part of it long after your name is forgotten and your house crumbles back into the earth. The forest remembers, even when humans forget, and your service is recorded in ways you do not fully understand, noted in the growth rings of trees and the movement of water through soil, and the complex exchanges of energy that bind all living things together into systems that predate language and will survive long after language fails. This is what it means to accept a gift from forest spirits, to carry that gift forward through years and decades, to transform obligation into service, and service into identity, and identity into a kind of belonging that humans rarely achieve with the natural world anymore. This is what you chose, or what chose you, and you live with it one day at a time, one walk at a time. One compass reading at a time, moving steadily toward an ending that is also a beginning, a dissolution that is also an integration, a loss that is also, in its way, a kind of coming home. The compass rests on the mantle, patient and unchanging, waiting for the next walk, the next warning, the next opportunity to guide someone either toward the forest or away from it, depending on what the situation requires. You will pick it up soon, in an hour or tomorrow, or whenever the pull becomes strong enough to overcome inertia. You will walk your familiar paths, watching for lost travellers, offering warnings when you can, serving the debt that grows lighter, but never quite disappears. Never fully releases you back into the life you lived before that evening, when you were lost and frightened, and so very grateful for help that arrived exactly when you needed it most. This is your life now, this endless walk between worlds, this constant vigilance at the threshold, this slow transformation from human to something else, over the course of years measured in compass readings and interventions, and quiet evenings spent listening to the forest breathe beyond your windows. You chose it, or it chose you, and the distinction has ceased to matter, has become irrelevant in the face of the simple fact that you are here, now, bound and serving and slowly being absorbed into the wild places that you once thought of as separate from yourself but have learned to recognize as home. The seasons turn with a rhythm you have learned to feel in your bones, each transition marked not by calendar dates, but by subtle shifts in light and temperature, and the behavior of animals that share the forest with you. Spring arrives not on a particular day in March, but rather in the moment when you notice the first wildflowers pushing through leaf litter, their stems pale and determined, their blooms small explosions of colour against the brown decay of winter. You walk through these early spring days watching the forest wake from dormancy, watching life return in waves that start with the smallest plants and progress upward through shrubs and finally to the great trees themselves, their buds swelling and then bursting into leaves that transform the bare branches into a canopy so dense that the forest floor becomes a different world entirely, dim and cool and mysterious. Summer brings a heaviness to the air, a thickness that makes breathing feel like work and turns your clothes damp with sweat within minutes of starting your walks. But you continue your rounds regardless of comfort, moving through the humid afternoons when most sensible people stay in air-conditioned spaces, watching for those who might venture into the forest unprepared for the heat or the sudden storms that build up and release with violent intensity. You have learned to read the sky, to know when the pale clouds mean nothing, and when the darker formations signal danger, when to warn people to turn back, and when the weather will hold long enough for them to complete their hike safely. You find them sometimes, the victims of summer storms, hikers who got caught far from shelter when the rain started, their clothing soaked and their spirits dampened by the realization that nature does not care about their schedules or their discomfort. They are vulnerable in these moments, open to offers of help in ways they might not be under other circumstances, and you have learned to position yourself between them and the beings that watch from the shadows, waiting for opportunities exactly like this. You offer practical assistance, sharing the emergency supplies you always carry, guiding them to overhangs where they can wait out the worst of the weather, giving them the mundane help that satisfies their need without creating obligations they cannot repay. The beings notice your interference, of course, and there are times when you feel their displeasure as a pressure in the air, a heaviness that settles over the forest like a held breath. They do not confront you directly, do not forbid your interventions, but you understand that your actions create a tension, a disturbance in the normal pattern of exchange and obligation. You are preventing them from doing what is their nature to do, from offering gifts and creating bonds and extending their influence into the human world through those who accept their help. But you're also fulfilling your service, performing the work you committed to when you chose the path of negotiation and repayment, and this too is part of the pattern, part of the complex system of give and take that governs all interactions in threshold spaces. Autumn arrives with a relief that feels almost physical, the oppressive heat breaking overnight as cold fronts sweep down from the north and the leaves begin their transformation into colours that seem impossible. Too bright, too saturated, as though the trees are burning with cold fire. You walk through carpets of fallen leaves that crunch underfoot and release the sweet scent of decay, that particular smell that exists only in autumn, only in forests, the smell of summer being composted into the nutrients that will feed next year's growth. The forest feels different in autumn, more active somehow, more present, as though the approach of winter sharpens the attention of everything that lives here, focusing their energy on the necessary preparations for survival. You notice that more people come to the forest in autumn, drawn by the spectacular foliage and the comfortable temperatures, and with them comes increased opportunity for the kind of encounters you have dedicated yourself to preventing. Lost hikers are more common when the trails are crowded, when people venture off marked paths trying to find better views or escape the crowds, when the shortening days catch them by surprise and darkness falls before they expected. You increase your own hours in the forest during these weeks, walking longer circuits, covering more ground, making yourself available in the places where people are most likely to need help, and therefore most vulnerable to offers from beings whose help comes with prices that will not become clear until far too late. You encounter a young woman one October afternoon, standing at a fork in the trail looking at her phone, with increasing frustration as she tries to make sense of a map that does not match the terrain around her. You recognize the early stages of being lost, the confusion that has not yet progressed to fear, but will shortly if she continues making wrong choices. You approach slowly, making noise so as not to startle her, offering assistance in the most mundane way possible. She accepts gratefully, showing you the map and explaining where she's trying to go, and you redirect her, pointing out the landmark she missed and the turn she should have taken half a mile back. As you talk with her, you notice movement in the peripheral vision, a figure standing just off the trail in the deep shadow beneath an old oak. The figure does not move, does not speak, simply observes your interaction with an attention that feels weighted, significant. You finish giving the young woman directions, watch her thank you, and head back the way she came, and only then do you turn to face the figure in the shadows. They step forward, becoming slightly more visible though, still not quite solid, still somehow blurred at the edges as though your eyes refuse to properly focus on their form. They ask if you're satisfied with your intervention, if you feel good about sending away someone who might have benefited from a different kind of help. Their tone is not angry exactly, not accusatory, but there is a quality to it that makes you understand they are not pleased with your constant interference. You stand your ground, clutching the compass in your pocket for reassurance, for reminder of why you do this work. You explain that the young woman was only mildly lost, that she would have found her way eventually, that she did not need the kind of help that creates permanent obligations. The being listens or appears to listen, and then says that perhaps you are right. Perhaps that particular person was not suitable for their purposes, but they wonder aloud if you will always be present, always available to intercept those who might otherwise accept their offers. The question hangs in the air between you, unanswerable because you know you cannot be everywhere, cannot prevent every exchange, can only do what you can with the time and energy you possess. The being seems satisfied by your silence, by the acknowledgement implicit in your failure to respond, and they fade back into the shadows beneath the oak, leaving you alone on the trail with the afternoon sun slanting through the trees and the knowledge that your service, no matter how dedicated, will never be enough to completely stop what has always happened in forests, what will continue to happen long after your own obligation is fulfilled, and you join the beings you have spent years trying to thwart. Winter comes hard that year, early snow falling in November and accumulating through December until the forest exists under a blanket of white that transforms everything, making familiar paths strange and mysterious, muffling sound and reflecting what little light penetrates the clouds. Fewer people visit the forest in winter, sensibly staying in warm houses rather than trudging through snow and ice. But those who do come are often more vulnerable, more likely to encounter difficulties that place them in need of help. You continue your walks despite the cold, bundling in layers and moving slowly through the snow, following paths you know by heart because the trail markers are buried and the landmarks are transformed by accumulation. You find footprints sometimes, tracks that lead away from established trails and deeper into the forest, and you follow them when you can, concerned that whoever made them might be in trouble, might need assistance before night falls and the temperature drops to dangerous levels. More often than not, the tracks lead nowhere interesting, just someone who wandered a short distance before returning to the trail. But occasionally you find situations that require intervention, people who are genuinely lost or injured or trapped by circumstances they did not anticipate when they decided to take a winter walk in the woods. You discover a man one January afternoon, sitting at the base of a tree, with his ankle twisted at an angle that makes you wince just looking at it. He has clearly been there for some time, snow accumulating on his shoulders and hat, his face pale with cold and pain. You approach carefully, announcing yourself so he knows you are human, real, not one of the beings that also walk these woods and might offer help that he should not accept. He looks up at you with relief so profound it is almost painful to witness, and he starts to thank you before you have even done anything, gratitude pouring out in a stream of words that reveals how frightened he has been, how close to despair. You assess his injury, determining that the ankle is badly sprained but probably not broken, and you help him to his feet, letting him lean on you as you slowly make your way back toward the trailhead. It takes nearly 2 hours to cover the distance, stopping frequently to rest, moving at a pace that accommodates his pain and your own fatigue from supporting his weight. He talks as you walk, filling the silence with explanations of how he got lost, how he slipped on ice, how he thought he was going to die out here because his phone was dead and he had not told anyone where he was going. You listen and make sympathetic noises and guide him steadily towards safety, toward the parking area where his car sits waiting, toward the world of hospitals and heated homes and all the comfortable certainties of modern life. As you near the trailhead, you catch a glimpse of a figure watching from the trees, and you understand that you have once again intervened in a situation where help might have been offered from other sources, help that would have come with obligations this man could not have understood or agreed to in any meaningful way. You feel the weight of that watching, the assessment being made of your actions and your choices, but you do not regret your intervention. The man reaches his car, thanks you profusely, offers you money which you decline, and drives away to seek medical treatment, never knowing how close he came to a different kind of rescue that would have changed his life in ways he cannot imagine. You turn back to the forest, to the figure that still watches from the shadows, and you meet their gaze as directly as you can given the difficulty of focusing on their form. They do not speak, do not need to speak, the message clear in their posture and their presence. You are interfering, preventing the natural course of events, inserting yourself into situations where your presence was not requested or required. But you're also serving, fulfilling the obligation you took on when you chose this path, and that service grants you certain rights, certain permissions to act within the forest in ways that ordinary humans cannot. It is a complicated balance, a negotiation that happens wordlessly, through actions and responses rather than explicit agreements, and you're still learning its parameters even after years of practice. The winter deepens, snow accumulating until the forest becomes nearly impassable, and your walks become shorter, more focused on the areas immediately around your home rather than the deeper trails that become dangerous in heavy snow. You use this time to study, to read more about forest ecology and the folklore of threshold spaces, to deepen your understanding of the system you are part of. You discover accounts from other cultures, other times, stories of people who served as intermediaries between human communities and the wild places that bordered them. Some were shamans or priests, their roles formally recognized and supported by their societies. Others were outcasts or hermits, people who could not or would not fit into normal social structures and found purpose in the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness. You recognize yourself in these stories, see the pattern of your own life reflected in accounts written centuries ago by people who would never have heard of the internet or smartphones or any of the technology that characterizes your era. The surface details change, but the underlying pattern remains constant. People who accepted obligations or found callings that placed them at the boundaries, watching and warning and serving the balance between worlds. You wonder sometimes if you chose this path or if it chose you, if your getting lost that day was accident or some kind of destiny, if the being who offered you the compass knew somehow that you were the kind of person who would choose service over surrender or resistance, who would dedicate years to the slow work of repayment through vigilance and intervention. The wondering leads nowhere useful, circles back on itself like the paths you walk in the forest, but you do it anyway, turning the questions over in your mind during the long winter evenings when darkness falls early and your house feels very small and isolated at the edge of the forest. You have grown accustomed to solitude, have learned to be comfortable with your own company, but there are moments when you miss the easy connection with other people, the casual relationships and simple conversations that were part of your life before the compass, and the obligation and the transformation that continues even now, slowly reshaping you into something that is neither fully human nor fully spirit, but something in between. Spring returns as it always does, the snow melting in patches and rivulets, the streams running high and fast with runoff, the forest floor emerging muddy and littered with the debris of winter. You resume your longer walks, reacquainting yourself with paths that were inaccessible during the coldest months, noting the changes that occurred while you were restricted to the areas near your home. A large tree has fallen, its roots torn from the earth by wind or ice, or simply the accumulated weight of centuries, and the gap in the canopy allows light to reach the forest floor in new patterns, already encouraging growth that will eventually fill the space the fallen tree occupied. This is how forests work, you have learned. Not as static entities, but as constantly changing systems where death feeds life and destruction creates opportunity for new growth. You find evidence of the being's activity during your walks, small signs that you have learned to recognize, a circle of mushrooms growing in a pattern too perfect to be natural, stones arranged in configurations that catch your eye for reasons you cannot articulate, areas where the air feels thicker somehow, weighted with presence even when nothing visible explains the sensation. You note these places, map them mentally, add them to your understanding of the forest geography and the locations where threshold spaces exist most strongly. These are the areas where you focus your attention, where you make sure to walk regularly, where lost travelers are most likely to encounter offers that they should refuse. You meet other people occasionally during your walks, other regular visitors to the forest who recognize you from previous encounters. Some nod in greeting and continue on their way. Others stop to chat, sharing observations about wildlife or trail conditions or the progress of the seasons. A few ask about your dedication to the forest, curious why you spend so much time here, what draws you back day after day regardless of weather or circumstance. You offer vague explanations about finding peace in nature, about preferring trees to people, about enjoying the solitude and the physical exercise. They accept these answers because they make sense, fit into familiar narratives about nature lovers and outdoor enthusiasts, and they do not press for deeper explanations of motivations that you could not articulate even if you wanted to share them. One regular hiker, an older woman who walks every morning with her dog, begins to seek you out specifically, altering her route to intersect with yours, lingering to talk when you meet. She tells you about her life, her retirement, her children who live far away and rarely visit, her husband who died 3 years ago, leaving her alone in a house that feels too large and too empty. You listen with patience and genuine sympathy, recognizing loneliness when you see it, understanding the need for connection that brings her to the forest, seeking conversation with someone who will listen without judgment or hurry. She asks eventually if you have noticed anything strange in the forest, anything unusual or difficult to explain, and the question makes you look at her more carefully, wondering what she has seen or experienced that prompts the inquiry. She describes an encounter from several weeks ago, a moment when she was walking alone, having left her dog at home due to a minor injury, and she became disoriented in an area she thought she knew well. She wandered for what felt like hours but was probably less, growing increasingly anxious as familiar landmarks failed to appear and the light began to fade. She was on the verge of real panic when she encountered someone who offered to guide her back to the trailhead, someone who seemed kind and knowledgeable and entirely trustworthy. But something made her hesitate, some instinct she cannot name, and instead of following the offered help, she thanked them and said she would wait where she was for another hiker to come along, that she did not want to trouble them to alter their route on her account. The figure had not insisted, had simply nodded and faded back into the forest, and within minutes she had recognized her surroundings, realized she was actually quite close to the main trail, and had only been confused by approaching from an unusual angle. She found her way out without difficulty, but the encounter stayed with her, nagging at her thoughts, making her wonder what would have happened if she had accepted the offered guidance. She looks at you as she finishes the story, and you recognize in her expression the same question you have asked yourself countless times, the wondering about roads not taken and choices that seem small in the moment, but carry consequences far beyond what is visible at the time. You tell her that she was right to trust her instinct, that sometimes the help that appears most timely is actually the most dangerous, that the forest has its own rules and its own inhabitants who do not always have human welfare at heart even when they seem to be offering assistance. She nods slowly, processing your words, and you can see her deciding whether to accept this explanation or dismiss it as superstition and imagination. She asks if you have had similar experiences, and you find yourself telling her a simplified version of your own story, the compass and the obligation and the years of service, editing out the parts that would sound too strange, too far beyond the realm of normal experience. She listens intently, and when you finish she's quiet for a long moment before saying that she suspected something like that she's always felt there was more to the forest than trees and animals, that she grew up hearing stories from her grandmother about the importance of courtesy in wild places, about not accepting gifts or eating food offered by strangers, about the necessity of maintaining boundaries between the human world and the other world that exists in shadow and silence. She thanks you for confirming what she felt, for validating instincts that she had worried were foolish or paranoid, and she promises to be more careful in the future, to trust those instincts when they tell her to refuse offers that seem too perfectly timed or too generously given. You continue to encounter her on your walks, and she becomes an informal ally in your work, someone who is alert to the presence of the beings and willing to warn others when she senses danger. She cannot do what you do, lacks the obligation that binds you to the forest, and grants you certain protections and permissions, but she can be careful herself, and she can share caution with others, can pass along her grandmother's warnings, and encourage people to maintain awareness of where they are and what they are accepting. It is small help, but you are grateful for it, grateful to not be entirely alone in your vigilance, grateful for another set of eyes watching the forest and another voice speaking words of caution. The years continue to pass, marked by the rhythm of seasons and the slow wearing away of your debt through constant service. The compass grows lighter, its weight diminishing so gradually that you do not notice the change from day to day, but only when you stop to consciously assess it, comparing its current heft to your memory of how it felt years ago when the obligation was fresh and the debt still heavy. You understand that this lightening is a sign of progress, an indication that your service is recognized and valued, that the balance is slowly shifting toward equilibrium. But you also understand that complete repayment lies still far ahead, years or perhaps decades yet before the compass becomes weightless, and you are released from the obligation that has structured your life for so long. You have stopped thinking about what that release might mean, stopped imagining a return to normal life, or the resumption of the existence you left behind when you accepted the compass that evening in the darkening forest. That life is gone, the person you were then transformed beyond recognition by years of service and solitude and slow integration into the rhythms of the wild places. Even if the obligation were lifted tomorrow, even if the compass suddenly became an ordinary object with no power or significance, you would not return to cities and relationships and the comfortable certainties of modern civilization. You belong to the forest now, a part of it in ways that have nothing to do with obligation, and everything to do with choice and habit, and the accumulation of years spent learning its patterns and serving its needs. You begin to understand that the distinction between debt and devotion has become meaningless, that you continue your walks and your interventions not because you must, but because you cannot imagine doing anything else, because this work has become so central to your identity that removing it would be like removing a limb or a sense, leaving you diminished and purposeless. The compass confirms this understanding, its weight no longer feeling like burden, but rather like anchor, something that keeps you grounded and oriented, something you would miss if it were gone. You have become what you were slowly becoming all along, a guardian of the threshold, a watcher at the boundary, someone who exists primarily in liminal spaces and serves the balance between worlds. The forest seems to recognize this shift, seems to accept your presence more fully than it did in the early years when you were still fighting against your circumstances, still trying to find loopholes or shortcuts that would allow you to fulfill your obligation without fundamentally changing who you were. You move through the trees now with a freedom and ease that was not available to you before, finding paths that did not exist on previous walks, accessing areas that were formerly closed or hidden. The beings acknowledge you when you encounter them, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of professional courtesy. Recognition between entities who serve similar functions, even if they approach those functions from different directions. You save a child one summer afternoon, a little girl who wandered away from her family's picnic and became hopelessly lost within minutes of leaving the cleared area where they had spread their blanket. You find her sitting under a tree crying, clutching a stuffed animal, and calling for her mother with increasing desperation. You approach slowly, speaking softly, making yourself non-threatening, and you crouch down to her level and tell her that you will help her find her family, that everything will be okay, that she just needs to come with you and stay close. She looks at you with the enormous eyes of childhood, trying to decide if you're safe, if you can be trusted. And you see the moment when she chooses to believe you, when she reaches out her small hand to take yours. As you lead her back toward the picnic area, following the sounds of adult voices calling her name with increasing panic, you feel another presence, another offer being prepared in case yours fails or is refused. You walk faster, pulling the child along with gentle insistence, and you emerge into the cleared area just as her mother is organizing a search party, just as the family is transitioning from worried to truly frightened. The mother sees her daughter and runs forward with a cry of relief, scooping the child up and holding her tight, and the child is crying and the mother is crying and everyone is talking at once in the chaotic way of emotional reunions. The mother thanks you profusely, asking how she can repay you, what she owes you for bringing her daughter back safely. You refuse any payment, any compensation, explaining that you were simply hiking nearby and heard the child calling, that anyone would have done the same, that you are glad you could help. The mother insists, pressing money into your hand that you hand back, offering to buy you dinner, or send you gifts, or put you in touch with the local media who would certainly want to do a story about your good deed. You refuse everything, extracting yourself from the situation as quickly as courtesy allows, uncomfortable with the gratitude and the attention and the assumption that your action requires reciprocity. As you walk away from the reunited family, you feel the weight of the watching, the presence that was prepared to offer different help if the child had remained lost longer, if fear and darkness had made her more vulnerable to alternatives. You understand that you have thwarted another exchange, prevented another binding, and you wonder, as you often do, whether the beings resent your interference or simply accept it as part of the pattern, part of the complex system of balance and exchange that governs all interactions in threshold spaces. The compass pulses once in your pocket, warmer than it should be given the ambient temperature, and you take that as acknowledgement, as approval, as confirmation that you did what you were supposed to do. The incident leaves you thinking about gratitude, about the human impulse to repay kindness and the dangers inherent in that impulse when the kindness comes from sources that operate under different rules. You have learned to be careful about accepting thanks, about receiving gifts or favours or any kind of compensation for the help you provide. Your service must remain unilateral, flowing in one direction only, never creating obligations that run back toward you. This is part of your protection, part of what allows you to move freely in the forest and intervene in situations where ordinary humans would be placing themselves at risk. You give without expecting return, and that giving creates a kind of immunity, a shield that the beings recognize and respect even when they are frustrated by your interference. You think about teaching this principle to others, about trying to spread the knowledge more widely, so that more people could serve as you serve, could help maintain the boundaries and prevent exchanges that hurt rather than help. But you know the teaching would be difficult, that most people are so thoroughly embedded in systems of reciprocity and obligation that asking them to help without expecting thanks or payment would seem unnatural, almost offensive. Modern culture has trained people to always keep accounts balanced, to never owe and never be owed, to carefully track who has done what for whom, so that debts can be repaid and relationships can remain equal. The idea of radical one-directional giving, of service that expects nothing and accepts nothing in return, runs counter to everything people have been taught about fairness and balance and appropriate social behaviour. But that is exactly what is required, you have learned, to safely operate in threshold spaces where normal rules of exchange become dangerous. You must give freely or not at all, must help without creating obligation, must serve without expecting service in return. Only then are you protected from the mechanisms that bind those who accept and those who offer. Only then can you move through the forest without becoming entangled in the web of debt and obligation that traps so many others. It is a hard lesson, one that took you years to fully internalize, and you're not sure it can be taught to those who have not experienced the consequences of violating it. Autumn arrives again, your favourite season, the time when the forest shows its most spectacular beauty, and when the boundaries between worlds seem thinnest, most permeable. You walk through carpets of leaves in shades of gold and crimson and orange, colours so vivid they seem artificial, created by an artist rather than by the natural process of chlorophyll breaking down and revealing the pigments that were hidden beneath green all summer. The air smells of apples and wood smoke and the earthy scent of mushrooms pushing up through leaf litter, decomposers that will break down this year's fallen leaves and return their nutrients to the soil that feeds the trees. You have developed routines over the years, patterns that you follow unconsciously, routes through the forest that you walk at specific times of day or week or season. These routines create a kind of presence, a predictability that allows others to find you when they need you, whether they are aware they are looking for you or not. The woman with the dog knows where you will be on Tuesday mornings. The beings know where you will be at dusk on Fridays. The forest itself seems to know your patterns, seems to adjust around them, creating spaces for your walking and observation. You have become a feature of the landscape, as much a part of the forest as the streams and the ancient trees and the beings who inhabit the shadows. People who regularly walk here begin to note your absence if you miss your usual rounds, concerned in the vague way of those who have come to rely on your presence without consciously acknowledging that reliance. You provide a sense of safety, of watchfulness, the knowledge that someone is paying attention and will intervene if intervention becomes necessary. It is not a role you sought or claimed explicitly, but it is the role you have grown into over years of dedicated service, over countless walks and interventions and quiet moments of observation. The compass has become almost weightless now, so light that you sometimes forget you are carrying it until you reach into your pocket and feel its familiar shape. The reduction in weight corresponds to a reduction in compulsion, the pull toward the forest less urgent than it was in the early years, less demanding of your constant attention and presence. You could, you think, spend more time away from the forest now, could reconnect with aspects of human life that you have neglected or abandoned. But the thought holds no real appeal, feels more like obligation than opportunity, and you realize that even if the compass disappeared entirely, even if you were released from all formal debt, you would continue living as you live now, walking the forest and watching the boundaries and intervening when necessary. This realization brings a kind of peace, a settling into acceptance of what your life has become and will likely remain. You're not waiting to be free because you are already free, have been free for years without recognizing it, the cage having disappeared while you were still looking for its door, the obligation transformed into choice so gradually that you never noticed the transition, never marked the moment when you began serving because you wanted to rather than because you must. The compass knows this, has known it longer than you have, its diminishing weight, a reflection not of debt repaid but of debt transcended, of obligation that has become devotion and service that has become identity. You continue your walks, your interventions, your constant vigilance at the places where worlds meet and rules change and unsuspecting humans place themselves in danger through simple ignorance or bad luck, or the desperation that makes refusing help seem impossible. You warn when you can, rescue when you must, serve because it has become your nature to serve. The forest accepts your presence, the beings acknowledge your role, and the years pass in a rhythm of seasons and service and slow, continuous transformation from what you were into what you are becoming, something that exists comfortably in liminal spaces, something that belongs neither fully to the human world nor fully to the wild, but rather to the threshold itself, to the boundary, to the place where giving and taking and obligation and freedom exist in complicated balance. The compass rests in your pocket. Light as a feather, heavy as a mountain, constant as the sunrise, present as your own heartbeat. You touch it sometimes without thinking, a gesture of reassurance or habit or simple acknowledgement of the bond that brought you here and keeps you here and will likely keep you here until your service reaches whatever natural conclusion awaits. You do not fear that ending. Do not spend time worrying about what comes after, too occupied with the present moment and the work that fills your days to waste energy on speculation about futures that cannot be known or controlled. You have learned to live in the present, to find satisfaction in the small victories of successful interventions, to accept the losses when you arrive too late, or when people refuse your warnings, and accept help from sources that will cost them more than they can afford. You cannot save everyone, cannot be everywhere, cannot prevent every binding or thwart every exchange. But you can do what you can do, can serve as you serve, can maintain your vigilance and your dedication, and your willingness to exist in the uncomfortable spaces between worlds where most people cannot or will not go. The forest continues around you, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to your presence or absence, operating according to rules that predate humanity and will continue long after humanity is gone. You're a small thing in the forest timeline, a brief flicker of consciousness and intention, here for a moment and then gone. But while you are here, while you walk these paths and watch these boundaries and intervene in these exchanges, you matter, make a difference, prevent suffering that would otherwise occur. It is enough, has to be enough, because it is what you have chosen and what you can offer and what the forest accepts from you in the slow, complex negotiation that structures your days and gives meaning to your existence. The light is fading now, dusk settling into the trees with its familiar weight, and you turn toward home, toward the house at the forest edge, where you will eat a simple dinner and read or rest, and eventually sleep before waking to walk the same paths tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, all the days that follow in an endless chain of service and observation and quiet devotion to the work you have claimed or that has claimed you. The compass guides you home, pointing always toward the forest even as you walk out of it, reminding you that home is both the building where you sleep and the trees where you serve, that you exist in both places and neither place, suspended between worlds in a state that should be uncomfortable, but has become, over years of practice and acceptance, something very close to peace. You wake before dawn as has become your habit, your body attuned to the rhythms of sunrise in ways that alarm clocks never managed to achieve during your previous life. The darkness outside your window is not complete, not the absolute black of midnight, but rather the deep blue-grey that precedes morning, the promise of light without its arrival. You lie in bed for a few moments, listening to the sounds of the forest waking around you. The birds beginning their morning songs in overlapping waves, each species contributing its particular voice to the symphony that greets every new day. You can identify them now by sound alone, have learned to distinguish the sharp call of a cardinal from the melodic warbling of a thrush, the harsh cawing of crows from the soft cooing of mourning doves. You rise and dress in layers, the morning still cool even in late spring, and you move through your small house with the efficiency of long practice, making coffee and toast, eating breakfast standing at the kitchen window, watching the light slowly increase and the forest emerge from shadow into visibility. The trees closest to your house are familiar as family. You have watched them through so many seasons now that you know their individual shapes and the patterns of their growth, can tell when a branch has fallen, or when new leaves are slower to emerge than they should be. You note these things without conscious thought, have developed an awareness of the forest that operates below the level of language, responding to changes and patterns before your thinking mind can articulate what you are observing. You drink your coffee slowly, letting the caffeine work its way into your system, preparing yourself for the long walk ahead. You will cover 12 miles today if everything goes according to plan, following a circuit that will take you through the most remote parts of the forest where hikers rarely venture, and where the beings are most active, most likely to encounter those few humans who do push into the deep wilderness. These are the areas where your presence matters most, where intervention is most frequently required, where the boundary between worlds is thinnest and most easily crossed by those who do not understand what they are crossing or what waits on the other side. You check your pack, ensuring you have the supplies you might need, water and energy bars and a first aid kit and emergency blanket, the practical tools that allow you to offer mundane assistance to those who need help without creating supernatural obligations. You have learned over the years that prevention often comes down to simple things, providing someone with water before they become desperately thirsty, offering a bandage before a small cut becomes infected, sharing food before hunger becomes unbearable, These small interventions prevent the desperation that makes people vulnerable to other kinds of offers, to help that comes with prices hidden in the fine print of agreements they do not realize they are making. The compass sits on the table beside the door, waiting as it always waits, and you pick it up and slip it into your pocket where it settles with familiar weight that is barely weight at all anymore. Present but not burdensome, acknowledged but not oppressive. You step outside into air that smells of pine and earth, and the particular freshness that exists only in early morning before the day is warmed and dried and begun its slow progression toward afternoon heat. The trail begins at the edge of your yard, a narrow path worn by your feet over years of daily walking, and you follow it into the trees, into the green dimness that feels more like home than the house you just left. The forest in morning is a different place than the forest at dusk, filled with energy and movement rather than the quiet watchfulness that characterizes evening hours. Birds are everywhere, flitting through branches and calling to each other, engaged in the serious business of feeding and defending territory and attracting mates. Squirrels chase each other in spiraling patterns up tree trunks, their claws making soft scratching sounds against bark. You startle a deer that was drinking from a small stream, and it bounds away with white tail flashing, crashing through underbrush, with less grace than its usual movement suggests. Panic overriding elegance in the moment of surprise. You walk steadily, not hurrying but not dawdling either, maintaining a pace that covers ground efficiently, while still allowing you to observe your surroundings, to notice the small details that might indicate problems or changes, or the presence of things that should not be present. You have developed a sense over the years, an awareness that operates partly through normal observation, and partly through something else, something that might be intuition, or might be a sensitivity that has grown from years of exposure to threshold spaces and the beings that inhabit them. You can often feel when something is wrong before you can see or hear evidence of the problem, a prickling at the back of your neck or a heaviness in your chest, or simply a growing certainty that you need to alter your route, to investigate an area that was not part of your planned circuit. Today, that feeling comes about 3 miles into your walk, pulling your attention toward the east where a ridge rises above the main valley. An area of rocky outcrops and sparse tree cover that offers spectacular views for those willing to make the steep climb. You pause, considering, weighing the pull against your planned route, and deciding that the feeling is strong enough to warrant investigation. You turn east, leaving the main trail and pushing through underbrush that grows thick in areas where the canopy opens enough to allow sunlight to reach the ground. The climb is steep, requiring you to use your hands in places, pulling yourself up over ledges and finding purchase on rocks that might be stable or might shift under your weight. You reach the ridge breathing hard, your legs burning from the exertion, and you pause to catch your breath and survey the area. At first you see nothing unusual, just the expected landscape of stone and stunted trees and patches of moss growing in cracks, where enough soil has accumulated to support life. But then you notice movement near the far edge of the ridge, a figure standing close to the drop-off, and you make your way carefully across the uneven terrain until you are close enough to see clearly. It is a man, middle-aged, wearing hiking clothes that are expensive and new, the kind of outfit that suggests someone who has recently taken up outdoor activities without yet developing the weathered comfort that comes from regular practice. He's standing very still, looking out over the valley below, and there is something in his posture that raises alarms in your mind, a quality of tension or despair that you have learned to recognize. You approach slowly, making noise so as not to startle him, and you call out a greeting that is casual and friendly, as though you are simply another hiker who happened to arrive at the same viewpoint. He turns to look at you, and you see in his face a complexity of emotions that confirms your concern. He is not simply enjoying the view. He is considering something, weighing something, standing at a different kind of edge than the physical cliff before him. You join him at the overlook, maintaining a careful distance, respecting his space while also positioning yourself between him and the drop. You make conversation about neutral things, the weather and the difficulty of the climb and the beauty of the vista spread below. He responds in monosyllables at first, but gradually his answers lengthen. And you can hear in his voice the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a great weight for a very long time. He tells you eventually, unprompted, that he lost his job 3 months ago, that his wife left him 2 months ago, that he's behind on his mortgage and his car payment and every other obligation that structures adult life. He tells you that he came up here to think, to figure out what to do next, to try to find some clarity or courage or reason to continue dealing with problems that feel insurmountable. You listen without judgment, without offering empty reassurances or hollow comfort, simply witnessing his pain and his confusion and his desire for the struggle to end. As he talks, you become aware of another presence on the ridge, a figure standing in the shadow of a large boulder, watching and waiting with patient attention. You cannot see them clearly, cannot determine if they are male or female or something else entirely, but you know what they are and what they will offer if given the opportunity. They will wait for you to leave, will approach this man when he is alone again, will offer him something that seems like a solution to his problems, a way forward that does not require him to face the difficult work of rebuilding his life piece by painful piece, and he will accept, probably, because he is desperate and tired and looking for any escape from circumstances that feel unendurable. You cannot leave, cannot walk away and let that encounter happen, so you settle in, sitting down on a flat rock and pulling out your water bottle, offering him some as though you plan to stay here for a while. He sits too, not close but not distant, and he continues talking, the words pouring out of him with the relief of someone who's been holding everything inside for too long. You listen and occasionally comment, not trying to fix his problems or offer solutions, simply being present with him in his pain, acknowledging the reality of what he's experiencing without trying to minimize or dismiss it. Hours pass this way, the sun climbing higher and the temperature increasing, and gradually the man's despair seems to ease slightly, not disappearing, but becoming less crushing, less absolute. He mentions eventually that he should probably head back, that he has taken up enough of your time, that he appreciates your listening, even though you are a stranger who owed him nothing. You offer to hike out with him, suggesting that the descent can be tricky, and it is always safer to have company on difficult terrain. He accepts, and together you make your way back down the ridge, moving carefully over the rocks and through the underbrush. As you walk, you feel the presence following at a distance, neither approaching nor retreating, simply observing your intervention, with what you interpret as frustration or perhaps resignation. You have prevented another exchange, delayed another binding, inserted yourself into a situation where your presence was not requested, but was desperately needed even if the man himself did not recognize that need. When you reach the main trail, the man thanks you again, and you can see in his face that something has shifted, that he is not fixed or healed but is perhaps slightly more capable of facing what comes next than he was when you found him on the ridge. He heads toward the parking area, and you watch until he disappears around a bend in the trail. Then you turn back toward the forest, toward the paths that lead deeper into the wilderness where your circuit continues. The presence is still there, still watching, and you finally turn to face it directly, meeting the gaze of the being who has been following you. They step forward, becoming slightly more visible, and they speak in that voice that is neither male nor female, neither young nor old, asking if you're satisfied with your interference, if you believe you have truly helped or merely delayed the inevitable. You consider the question seriously, not dismissing it as rhetorical or hostile, understanding that it carries genuine inquiry about the nature and value of your service. You respond that you do not know if you have helped in any permanent way, that the man still faces all the same problems that brought him to the ridge, that his circumstances have not changed simply because you sat with him for a few hours. But you also know that sometimes survival comes down to getting through a single moment, a single hour, a single day, and that the help you provided might be enough to carry him past the point of crisis into a space where other options become visible again. The being listens, their expression unreadable, and then they say something that surprises you. They say that they understand your purpose, that they do not resent your interventions as much as you might think, that you serve a function in the ecosystem of exchange and obligation just as they serve a function, that both roles are necessary to maintain the balance that allows the system to continue. They say that without people like you, without guardians at the threshold, their own work would become meaningless, that gifts offered to those who have no capacity to choose are not gifts at all, but rather something closer to predation, and that is not their purpose or their nature. You have never heard a being speak this way before, never encountered one willing to explain their perspective or acknowledge your role as anything other than interference. You ask questions, carefully, not wanting to break the moment of communication, but needing to understand more fully. They explain that they offer, because offering is their nature, but they prefer that those who accept do so with some degree of awareness, some recognition that they are entering an exchange rather than simply receiving charity. Your interventions, they suggest, serve to educate, to raise awareness, to ensure that those who do accept their offers do so with at least minimal understanding of what acceptance means. The conversation continues for longer than you expected, the being surprisingly forthcoming about the rules that govern their existence and the constraints under which they operate. You learn that they are bound by certain limitations, that they cannot lie directly though they can mislead through omission or careful phrasing, that they cannot force acceptance but only offer and wait for response, that they must honour refusals even when those refusals frustrate their purposes. You learn that there are hierarchies among the beings, that some are older and more powerful than others, that the one you accepted the compass from was relatively young and inexperienced, which perhaps explains why your debt has been easier to manage than some of the stories suggest. Eventually the being falls silent, and you understand that the conversation is ending, that they have said what they meant to say, and now will return to whatever existence they inhabit when not interacting with humans. They fade back into the forest, becoming less distinct and then invisible, and you are alone again on the trail with the afternoon sun slanting through the trees and the knowledge that you have learned more about the nature of your service than you learned in all the previous years combined. You continue your walk, completing the circuit you planned at the beginning of the day, but your mind is occupied with processing the conversation, with integrating this new understanding into your existing framework of knowledge and belief. You return home as dusk approaches, tired but satisfied with the day's work, and you prepare a simple meal and eat while watching the light fade outside your window. The compass sits on the table beside you, and you pick it up absently, turning it over in your hands, noting how light it has become, how the needle barely moves now when you rotate the casing. You understand that your service is approaching its conclusion, that the debt you incurred years ago is nearly satisfied, that soon you will face a choice about what comes next, about whether you continue this life because you choose it, or whether you attempt to return to something more recognizably human. But that choice lies ahead, not yet urgent, not yet requiring decision. For now you continue as you have continued, walking the forest and watching the boundaries and intervening when intervention becomes necessary. The work fills your days and gives structure to your existence and connects you to something larger than yourself, larger than your individual concerns or desires. You have become part of the forest ecology, as much a functional component as the trees that provide habitat, or the streams that provide water, or the decomposers that return nutrients to the soil. You serve a purpose, fulfill a role, contribute to the balance that allows the system to function. The seasons continue their endless rotation, each one arriving with familiar patterns and subtle variations. No two springs exactly alike, but all springs recognizably spring, all winters winter, all autumns autumn. You mark time by these natural rhythms rather than by calendars or clocks, aware of dates and days of the week, only in the vague way of someone who exists primarily outside the structures of modern timekeeping. Your body knows when to wake and when to sleep, when to increase activity and when to conserve energy, operating according to ancient patterns that predate human civilization, and will continue long after civilization has collapsed or evolved into something unrecognizable. You have noticed that you are aging, the process visible in the mirror when you remember to look, in the increasing stiffness of joints when you wake in the morning, in the way that climbs that were once easy now require more effort and leave you breathing harder. You're not old yet, not by modern standards, but you're no longer young, have crossed some invisible threshold into middle age, and are progressing steadily toward whatever comes next. You wonder sometimes how long you can continue this work, how many years your body will allow you to walk 12 miles through rough terrain, how long before injury or illness or simple accumulated wear makes the service you provide impossible to maintain. But those concerns feel distant, abstract, less urgent than the immediate work of each day. You will continue as long as you can continue, and when you can no longer continue, someone else will take your place. Or no one will, and the forest will manage without your interventions as it managed for millennia before you arrived. You're not essential, are merely useful, a small cog in a vast machine that would function with or without your contribution. The recognition of your own ultimate insignificance should be depressing, but instead feels liberating. freeing you from the burden of believing that everything depends on your actions, allowing you to simply do what you can do without torturing yourself over what you cannot do. You encounter the woman with the dog on one of your morning walks, and she tells you that her daughter is visiting from across the country, bringing grandchildren that the woman has only seen in photographs and video calls. She's excited but also nervous, worried that she has become too strange, too focused on the forest and its mysteries, too comfortable with solitude to properly engage with family relationships. You reassure her that she will be fine, that people are more adaptable than they think, that she can navigate both worlds even if one has become more familiar than the other. She thanks you and continues on her way, and you hope that your reassurance was justified, that she will indeed manage the visit without difficulty. The visit apparently goes well because you see her a week later looking pleased and relaxed, telling you stories about her grandchildren's fascination with the forest, how they wanted to explore every trail and examine every interesting rock and splash in every stream. She brought them to the forest daily during their visit, sharing her knowledge and her love of this place. And she thinks perhaps she planted seeds of awareness in them, taught them to pay attention to their surroundings and to be cautious about accepting help from strangers, even when that help seems friendly and harmless. You praise her efforts, pleased that the next generation is learning lessons that might protect them, that might allow them to navigate threshold spaces with appropriate caution and awareness. You begin to notice more young people in the forest, families with children, scout troops, school groups on educational outings. The forest has always attracted visitors, but the numbers seem to be increasing. More people seeking connection with nature, seeking escape from screens and schedules and the overwhelming complexity of modern life. You watch these groups with mixed feelings. Glad that more people are experiencing the forest, but concerned about the increased pressure on the ecosystem, the wear on trails, the noise and disruption that large groups inevitably create. You also worry about the increased opportunities for dangerous exchanges. More people means more chances for someone to become lost or injured, or desperate enough to accept help from sources that should be refused. You find yourself intervening more frequently, the rhythm of your days increasingly occupied with guiding lost hikers and providing first aid for minor injuries and offering water or food to those who underestimated the difficulty of their planned routes. Most of your interventions are mundane, requiring nothing more than basic outdoor skills and common sense. But occasionally you encounter situations that carry the weight of something more serious, moments when you can feel the presence of beings watching and waiting for opportunities that you work to prevent. You save a Boy Scout who twisted his ankle badly enough that walking was impossible, carrying him on your back for 2 miles to the nearest road where his troop leaders were waiting with increasing anxiety. You guide a couple in their 70s who took a wrong turn and ended up miles from their intended destination, gently redirecting them without making them feel foolish for their mistake. You provide emergency supplies to a young woman who started a day hike without adequate preparation and found herself in trouble when the weather turned unexpectedly cold. Each intervention is small, barely worth noting individually, but collectively they represent hundreds of hours of service, hundreds of moments when you placed yourself between vulnerable people and the beings who would offer them help that came with invisible prices. The compass has become so light now that you can barely feel it in your pocket, its presence more memory than physical sensation, and you know without being told that your debt is nearly satisfied, that the obligation you have carried for so many years is approaching its completion. You feel no particular emotion about this recognition, neither relief nor regret, just a calm acknowledgement of fact. The debt will be satisfied, and then what? You will continue walking the forest because walking the forest is what you do, what you have become, what you cannot imagine not doing. The obligation may end, but the devotion remains. The sense of purpose and connection that has grown from years of service will not disappear simply because the formal structure that initiated it has dissolved. You wonder sometimes about the man you were before the compass, before the obligation, before the slow transformation that changed you from a person who occasionally visited forests into a person who exists primarily in forests and only occasionally visits human civilization. That person feels distant, almost fictional, someone you remember but cannot quite believe you were. The concerns that occupied that person seem trivial now, small worries about career advancement and social status, and whether you were living up to some imagined potential. You do not miss that person or that life. Do not feel that you lost anything important when you accepted the compass and began this journey. If anything, you feel that you found something, discovered a purpose and a place that fit you better than anything in your previous existence. But you also recognize that your perspective might be skewed by years of isolation and the subtle influence of forces you do not fully understand. Perhaps you've been changed in ways that are not entirely positive, shaped by your service into something that can no longer properly function in normal human society. Perhaps if you had refused the compass, if you had found your own way out of the forest that evening, you would have returned to your life and continued developing in different directions. Directions that might have led to satisfactions and achievements you cannot now imagine because you have been walking a different path. These thoughts arrive occasionally, usually late at night when sleep is slow to come, and your mind wanders through paths of memory and speculation. But they do not trouble you deeply, do not create real regret or lasting doubt. You made choices with the information and understanding you possessed at the time, and those choices led you here, to this life, to this work, to this strange existence at the boundary between worlds. Perhaps other choices would have led to other lives that would have been equally satisfying or more so, but those alternative lives exist only in imagination, in the realm of might have been that is interesting to contemplate, but ultimately irrelevant to the actual circumstances of your existence. You continue your daily walks, your constant vigilance, your service to the forest and its inhabitants, both human and other. The work has become so natural that you no longer think about it consciously, your body moving through familiar patterns while your mind is free to observe and consider and exist in the present moment without the constant chatter of planning and worrying that once occupied so much of your mental energy. You have learned a kind of peace that was not available to you in your previous life, a settling into acceptance of things as they are rather than constant striving toward things as they might be. The being you spoke with on the ridge appears occasionally during your walks, not approaching but visible at a distance, observing your activities with what you interpret as professional interest. You nod in acknowledgement when you see them, and they nod back, a gesture of mutual recognition between entities who serve different but complementary functions in the same system. You have developed something that might be called respect for each other, not friendship exactly, but an understanding of shared purpose even when that purpose manifests in opposing actions. One evening as you walk your usual circuit at dusk, you encounter a situation that requires all your accumulated skill and understanding to navigate successfully. You find a teenage girl sitting on a fallen log, crying with the particular intensity of adolescent emotion, her phone clutched in her hand and her backpack sitting beside her on the ground. You approach carefully, uncertain whether intervention is needed or whether she simply needs private space to process whatever is causing her distress. But as you get closer, you feel that familiar prickling of awareness, the sense that something more than ordinary teenage drama is unfolding here, that she is in a kind of danger that has nothing to do with physical harm. You sit down on the log at a respectful distance, not speaking immediately, simply sharing the space and allowing her to notice your presence and decide whether to acknowledge it. She looks up eventually, wiping tears from her face, and she tells you unprompted that she has run away from home, that she cannot go back, that she would rather die than face her parents after what happened. The details emerge slowly. A typical story of teenage rebellion and parental overreaction, and the particular kind of drama that feels world-ending in the moment, but usually resolves into something manageable given time and perspective. But the girl is not interested in time or perspective, is convinced that her life is effectively over, that she has no options and no future worth pursuing, and as you talk with her, you become aware of multiple presences gathering in the surrounding forest, beings attracted by her despair and her stated willingness to die, seeing opportunity in her emotional crisis. They do not approach, not yet, but they are preparing, waiting for the right moment to offer help that would seem perfectly reasonable to someone in her state of mind, help that would promise escape or transformation or simply an end to the unbearable pain she is currently experiencing. You cannot simply tell her to go home, cannot dismiss her feelings or minimize her situation without losing whatever fragile trust you are building. But you also cannot leave her here, cannot walk away, knowing what will happen if she remains in the forest as darkness falls and her desperation deepens. So you employ a strategy you have developed over years of similar interventions, neither agreeing with her assessment of the situation nor arguing against it, but rather focusing on immediate practical concerns that distract from the emotional spiral while also moving her physically out of this dangerous space. You mention that it is getting cold, that she's not dressed warmly enough, that staying in the forest overnight without proper equipment would be miserable and potentially dangerous. You offer to walk her to the trailhead, where she can at least be somewhere with light and shelter, while she decides what to do next. You frame it not as going home, but simply as leaving the forest, as making a choice that keeps her options open, rather than foreclosing them by remaining here. She resists at first, but eventually agrees, perhaps simply too tired to keep arguing, and together you walk slowly toward the parking area while you listen to her story, and offer the kind of neutral acknowledgement that allows her to feel heard, without reinforcing her more destructive impulses. The presences follow at a distance, not giving up but not interfering either, respecting the fact that you have intervened and that she has accepted your intervention, creating a temporary protection that they will not breach. When you reach the parking area, the girl's phone suddenly has signal again, and it begins buzzing with messages and missed calls from her parents who are clearly frantic with worry. You suggest that she might want to at least tell them she is safe, not promising to go home but simply providing basic information that they are probably desperate for. She considers this and eventually sends a brief text, and within seconds her phone rings with her mother calling. The conversation that follows is tense but not as terrible as the girl feared, her mother expressing relief and concern rather than the anger and punishment she expected. You step away to give her privacy, but you watch from a distance, ready to intervene again if needed. Eventually she hangs up and tells you that her parents are coming to pick her up, that they promised to talk calmly rather than yelling, that maybe things are not quite as hopeless as they seemed an hour ago. You wait with her until her parents arrive, ensuring that the reunion is as calm as the circumstances allow, and then you fade back into the forest, satisfied that you have successfully prevented another dangerous exchange. As you walk home in full darkness, you feel the weight of the being's attention, their frustration at another intervention, another opportunity lost. But you also feel something else, a sense of acknowledgement, recognition that your work is legitimate and necessary, that you serve a function they understand even if they would prefer that function did not exist. The compass is almost weightless now in your pocket, barely present, and you know with sudden certainty that your debt is satisfied, that the obligation that brought you into this work has been fulfilled, that you are free to choose what comes next without the compulsion that has driven you for so many years. The knowledge sits heavy despite the compass's lack of weight, forcing you to confront questions you have been avoiding about what you want and who you are, and whether your service will continue because you choose it, or because you cannot imagine any other life. You walk through the dark forest with these questions swirling in your mind, and you realize that the answer is complicated, that you continue partly from choice and partly from habit, and partly from the simple fact that you cannot return to who you were before all this began, that the transformation is complete and permanent, and you are what you have become through years of service and solitude and gradual integration into the forest's rhythms. You reach your house and sit on the porch rather than going inside, looking out at the dark trees and the stars visible through gaps in the canopy above. The night is quiet except for the usual sounds of the forest, insects singing and small animals moving through undergrowth and the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. You feel at peace despite the questions, at home despite the strangeness of your circumstances, content with the life you have built even as you recognize its limitations and costs. You will continue your walks, your interventions, your service to the threshold and the balance it represents. Not because you must, but because you choose to, because this work gives meaning to your existence and connects you to something larger than yourself, because you have found in the forest what you could not find in the cities and suburbs and all the spaces of normal human life. The compass sits in your palm, so light now it might as well be made of air, and you understand that soon it will disappear entirely, will simply cease to exist once the debt is fully satisfied and the bond is completely dissolved. You will miss it in some ways, this object that has been your constant companion for so many years, this reminder of the choice you made and the path you chose and the obligation you fulfilled. But you will continue without it, carrying its lessons and its weight in memory rather than in physical form, walking the forest because walking the forest is who you are and what you do, and the life you have chosen, even if the choosing happened gradually over years rather than all at once in a single moment of decision. You go inside eventually, ready for sleep, ready for tomorrow's walk and all the walks that will follow, ready to continue serving the forest and its visitors and the delicate balance that exists at the threshold between worlds. The compass rests on your nightstand one final time, catching the moonlight that streams through your window, reflecting it back in a soft glow that is beautiful and peaceful and entirely natural. You close your eyes and drift towards sleep with the sense that something is ending and something is beginning, that you have reached a transition point in your service that will change its nature if not its substance, that you're entering a new phase of existence that will reveal itself gradually as you continue your patient work at the boundary between human and wild, between ordinary and extraordinary, between the world of daylight and the world that exists in shadow and silence, waiting.